Hello and welcome. I am Bruno Nicola, lecturer in the history of the Middle East at Goldsmiths, University of London. Now, this video is part of a series of History at Goldsmiths films and live webinars we are designing for A-level students. The History Department at Goldsmiths is a tight-knit community in the world's cultural capital of London, offering a global range of different subjects. We are extremely proud of our teaching. We offer creative degrees that tackle topics that you won't find anywhere else in the educational system. And we can do so because we are at the forefront of research on these topics. If you want to know more, or if you are considering applying to us for a degree, or if you would like to take part in the A-level webinars, please click on the links in the description below or contact our admission tutor, whose email is also here in the description. Now, today we will be talking about a fascinating phenomenon that happened in medieval times, that's the Crusades. And we will do so by considering both the Christian and the Muslim perspective on these events. Now, since there are literally dozens of videos talking about the Crusades that you can find in YouTube and different platforms, I think it might be more useful if we can spend some time addressing some specific questions about the Crusades. And I think by looking at these specific questions and some key ideas, this may be a helpful guide in preparation for A-level exams and courses you need to prepare for next year. So instead of looking at more of a factual information or looking more at dates or names or different specific figures about the Crusades, we're going to be looking at a series of different topics and addressing different questions that might be a useful guide for you. So let's get started. Now, although it refers to a set of events that happened in medieval times, the term Crusades remains very much in use in modern times. It has been used positively in trying to unite efforts for noble causes, such as, for example, in describing Greta Thunberg's climate activism as a crusade to save the planet, or also to describe the acts of activists, such as a crusade for equality or a crusade for freedom. However, it has also been used in a less positive and more aggressive intention in order to describe acts of aggression to other countries, for example, such as when George W. Bush used it to describe his war on terror in 2001 as a crusade on terror. Or Nixon, for example, also used it back in the 1970s to describe his crusade on drugs. But if we look at the standard definition of the crusade as a historical phenomenon, it could be summarized as a series of military expeditions that were religiously motivated and often directed, initiated, and supported by the Latin Church against the Muslim territories in the Middle East. The Council of Clermont in 1095 in southern France is generally considered the official starting point for the Crusades. In this meeting of the main representatives of the Latin Church, Pope Urban II made an appeal to help the Christian Byzantine Empire and the people that were being invaded by Turkish Muslims in Anatolia. Sources tell us that from the pulpit, Pope Urban II called upon Christendom to march to the east and reconquer the Holy Land for Christianity, a place that, remember, has been in Muslim hands for more than 400 years. However, although we can have Clermont as an initial point, I believe history cannot be seen as simply a succession of clear-cut events, with a specific moment working as a starting point or another moment starting and finishing point. These are tools that we use in order to understand processes better. For example, if we look from the Islamic sources, they see the Crusades as beginning much earlier than the Council of Clermont, with Frankish, that is European, military incursions documented already decades before the Council, at the ages of the Islamic war, for example, in Sicily or even in Spain, both territories that at the time in the 11th century were part of Muslim kingdoms. Similarly, while Western historians will often have 1291 and the Muslim reconquest and fall of Acre as the end of the Crusades, the aggression and calling for crusade efforts among Christians will continue at least until the 15th century with certain force and continue sometimes into the 17th century. At this point, in the 15th century, the Crusade spirit will be transformed in the West. After the Ottoman armies finally conquered Constantinople in 1453, and Christopher Columbus brought news of what he thought was a new maritime road to China at the end of that century, in the 15th century, the expansionist effort of European kingdoms were slowly redirected towards the Americas instead of towards Islamic kingdoms. So that's how the Crusade is both a medieval term although it can also be used in modern times. Now, this is a difficult question to answer. Now, officially, there has been 8 crusades to the Middle East in medieval times. Each has its own characteristics, protagonists, and outcome. The first one, between 1096 and 1099, was the most successful of all the crusades. It's the one that started at the Council of Clermont. It occurred when the Latin armies managed to conquer Jerusalem and establish different Christian states in the Middle East, such as the counties of Edessa and Tripoli, the principalities of Antioch and Cilicia, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. None of the following crusades achieved the same military success, and some, like the fourth, ended up in treason among Christians when the Crusaders sieged, violently sacked, and conquered not the Muslim land or city, but the glorious city of Constantinople, capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, apart from these 8 official crusades to the Middle East, the crusades were also called on Muslims in other territories, not in the Middle East, such as Spain, Sicily, and North Africa. And there are also a number of small crusades that were launched against dissident Christian sects within Europe, such as the Albigensian Crusade in 1209-1229 against the Christian reformist movement of the Catars, who were considered heretic by the Pope. There were even some interesting crusades in this period that help us to understand better the larger impact that the idea of the crusade had in the mindset of medieval Europeans. There were more popular enterprises by the poor and less privileged classes in medieval Europe that were self-called or self-addressed as crusaders. For example, there was the one called the People's Crusades that occurred in response to Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont of the First Crusade, in which a multitude of people suddenly took the road and marched east, only to be massacred by the Turks in Anatolia. This is like an alternative crusade to the one of the nobles, or a popular crusade made by the people. Another one of these examples of popular crusades is the Crusade of the Poor, an unauthorized military expedition undertaken in the early 14th century by commoners to reconquer the Holy Land after the fall of Acre that supposedly marked the end of the Crusades, which resulted not only in looting and persecution of European Jews, for example, on their way to the Middle East of these people, but also confrontation with local authorities, so creating a lot more damage in Europe than never making to the Middle East themselves. So a number of different crusades, there are the official ones, but also popular ones, and not always directed only to the Middle East. Now, this is a central question, I think, although very difficult to answer as well. Now, I am of the idea that whenever we want to reflect upon a historical event or a historical process, it is useful to think about why this happened, and especially why this particular event or process happened at a particular time and place. In other words, to look at the context in which these events happened. Now, the Crusades' primary objective were to stop the expansion of the Muslim states, and, if possible, reclaim Christianity, the Holy Land, and the Middle East. However, the holy sites have been under Muslim control for over 400 years, and the Muslim expansion and conquer of territory has been going on for some time now. So why at this time? Why at this moment the Crusades occurred? So there have been scholarly debates about the causes of the Crusades. There were certainly political causes that explained the call for holy war. Now, the Turks were advancing against Byzantium in Anatolia in the 11th century, and the call for help of Byzantium to the Pope might have seen by Urban II as a good opportunity to channel abroad the problems that there were between different kingdoms within Europe and between different kingdoms and the papacy itself. So in a way, the call for help of the Emperor of Byzantium was a good political excuse for the Pope to try to send the Crusades eastward, to send all these nobles from Europe eastward to fight a common enemy instead of fighting each other. But there have also been causes calling for a demographic pressure in Europe that may be a cause for the Crusades, in which there was supposed to be a surplus of population in Europe at the 11th century that could not be absorbed by the structure of the feudal economic system that was widespread in Europe. and might have been seen in the call of the Pope a good opportunity, the people and the nobles, a good opportunity for an economic prosperity that Europe could not offer. So, in other words, a way to go away from Europe and try to strive luck somewhere else. But in addition to economic and political circumstances that certainly play a role in kicking off the Crusades, many participants of the Crusades also believed that undertaking what they saw as holy war was a means of redemption and a way to achieve the expiation of their own sins. Now, Pope Urban II called for a renewed and generalized peace of God at the Council of Clermont, and a statement that promulgated peace while officially sanctioning war. Now, the Pope was appealing to one of the core justifications for the Crusades, and that is providing aid to fellow Christians in the East and to defend Christendom, actions that were not only justifiable, but considerable as pleasing in the eye of God. Therefore, the Crusades also coincide with a particular spiritual moment in the history of Christianity, a time in which apocalyptic expectations that considered that 1,000 years gone since the death of Jesus were a sign that the end of the world was imminent. This was a common belief among many Christians of the 11th century. It was also a time full of popular beliefs in which the second coming of Christ in Jerusalem was perceived as near. This was something that was coming any day now. So these ideas made the city of Jerusalem a prominent place in the mindset of the 11th century Christian, something that perhaps was not so much in the previous centuries. People began to perform pilgrimage to Jerusalem in large numbers even before the Crusades. And Jerusalem became a popular destination for the faithful, together with other pilgrimage sites in Europe such as Rome or Santiago de Compostela. So in answer or in thinking for the causes of the Crusades, that like many other events in history, I think it's important to consider that it's a multi-reasons or the multi-level answer. There were political, there were economic, but it was a particular context of spirituality, of sense of the end of the war, that also put together a collective sense in which the call for the Pope was well received and the Crusades happened. I guess the answer to this question is it depends what do we consider success. Now, in terms of the military success, the First Crusade was the most successful one in compared to any of the other Crusades. In this First Crusade, the Crusaders conquered Nicaea in Turkey, Antioch, and then they were all the way into the Holy Land to conquer Jerusalem and establishing a string of Crusade ruler states we had mentioned earlier. However, the success was not only the result of a military superiority or can solely be attributed to the heroism and religious commitment of the Crusaders. The political fragmentation of the Islamic Middle East and the surprise factor that the sudden arrival of the Crusaders had among the Muslims of this region was an important element that helps to understand better the success of this first campaign. The majority of Muslim Jews and Eastern Christians that lived in the Middle East at the time might have had no clue who these Crusaders were, nor why they were invading their lands all of a sudden. Now, it has been argued that local Muslim princes in the region might have initially thought that they were mercenaries hired by a more traditional Christian enemy they had, such as the Byzantines of Constantinople. So they would expect this band of mercenaries to enter their territories, conquer, loot, and withdraw back to Christian lands. The establishment of counties, principalities, and even the kingdom of Jerusalem might have seen an unimaginable outcome for the Muslim perspective, but also from the Christian one. Now, at the time of the Crusades, the Muslim world was divided between different opposing kingdoms with diverse ethnic backgrounds and confronting religious views on Islam, and this is an important factor. Most of today's Egypt and North Africa was under the political control of the Fatimids, for example, a Shia Arab dynasty. In opposition to them, we have the Arab Sunni Caliph in Baghdad, who at the time had little political control over the Muslim lands, but remained a key religious figure in the area. The other big political player in the Middle East were the Seljuks, a Sunni Turkish dynasty that have recently appropriated most of the Middle East and controlled through some local princes the holy site of Jerusalem on the one hand, but also Mecca and Medina on the other side. And this was the big political opposition to the Fatimids of Egypt and North Africa. So in this context, for a while, the Crusade states that were resulting from the First Crusade managed to integrate themselves, to incorporate themselves as yet another political actor in these fragmented territories of the Holy Land at the time, until a time when, during the first decade of the 12th century, the initial surprise of the First Crusade vanished in the eyes of the Muslims, and a more organized and united Muslim opposition to the Latin kingdoms began to grow. So after the initial success of the First Crusade, for over 40 to 50 years, the Crusaders integrated within this landscape of political division of the Holy Land. The first big backlash for the Crusaders in the Holy Land came from the local Muslim leader called Imad al-Din Sangi, who sieged and conquered Edessa from the Latins in 1144. The Crusaders' defeat was used as a reason for the Pope in Rome to justify the calling of the Second Crusade, that was utterly defeated first in modern-day Turkey and afterward failed in its attempt to conquer Damascus in Syria. Now, the fall of Edessa signifies a beginning of the Muslim counterattack to regaining the Holy Land under the leadership of a Kurdish soldier turned sultan and founder of the new dynasty, the Ayyubid dynasty, called Salah ad-Din, commonly known in the West as Saladin. Now, being a subject first of the Sangis, but also being appointed a vizier of the Fatimid court in Egypt, he managed to bring both Egypt and Syria under his command and became the political figure that symbolized a new unity among the previously fragmented Muslim kingdoms. He led the Muslim army to the decisive victory at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 and commanded the siege and definitive conquest of Jerusalem for the Muslims in 1187. Now, the fall of the holy city of Jerusalem motivated the Third Crusade, which resulted in the capture of Cyprus, this island in the Mediterranean, not in the mainland Holy Land, and the successful siege of Acre by Richard I of England. Besides, the King of England, Richard Lionheart, forces the defeat of Saladin in the Battle of Arsuf and also in Jaffa. Richard managed to sign a peace treaty with Saladin, allowing the Christians access to the holy sites and to Jerusalem, but the kingdom of Jerusalem was lost forever, and the city never returned back into Christian hands and went to be part of the Muslim empires since then. So by the end of the 12th century, the new Muslim unity, encouraged by a new sense of jihad and inspired by the command of Saladin, regained control of most of the Holy Land, leaving Latin Crusaders cornered in coastal regions of the Mediterranean Sea. So it took 50 years for Muslims to reorganize themselves, to find unity, and under the command of Saladin, start the recovering of the lands that the Crusaders took in the First Crusade. Now, because the Crusades were a military endeavor, they certainly were full of bloody battles, treacherous acts, and religious confrontation between Muslims and Christians. However, in this period, like in any other in history, there was also coexistence, there was also political compromise between rulers, military alliances between Muslims and Christians, and also there was trade that was stimulated at this period, scientific exchange, and also love between people. I think it is important to understand that the population of European origin in the Crusader state was always small. Despite the fact that there were a constant flux of settlers coming into these newly conquered territories and Crusaders continuously arrived in different waves, most of the original Crusaders who fought in the First Crusade returned home. That means that the Crusaders were a minority, ruling over a majority of population that was culturally Arabic-speaking and religiously diverse. So, for example, the people in the Kingdom of Jerusalem included some Muslims, including Jews, include Eastern Christians, and also included Muslims that converted to Christianity because of Christian rule in the area. In time, the descendants of the European settlers, who had grown up in the Middle East, began to think of themselves as natives, rather than migrants, and although they retained aspects of their identity as Western Europeans, or Franks as they were known in medieval times, their clothing, diet, and language incorporated Middle Eastern influences, especially those of Eastern Christians. So chronicles from medieval times mentions that many of the Crusaders and their descendants learned Greek, Arabic, and other Eastern languages, for example. They also intermarried, for example, with one another. The Crusaders will intermarry with native Christians, such as Greeks, Syriac, or Armenians, and sometimes even with converted Muslims. So I think it's important to consider the relationship between Christians and Muslims in the Crusader period as something that went into different levels. On the one hand, we have the political aspect, in which the kingdoms, the kings, the princes, the emperors, they all fight to each other and make their own political interaction. But also there is the people that was living in the area, like always in history. And in this level of people is when there was a much more permeable interaction between Christian, Muslims, and Jews in the Crusader period. Of course, there was conflict, but there was also coexistence. Or I will argue that the legacy of the Crusades can be seen in at least two different levels. On the one level, there is the impact that the Crusades had in the pre-modern times. In this case, the Crusades slowed the advance of the Islamic power that up to that point had been gaining territories both in the east, for example, against Byzantium, but also in the west, if we consider, for example, the Arab invasion of Spain. Now, the Crusader states extended trades also with the Muslim world, bringing new tastes on foods to Europe and stimulating travel and exploration in the mind of Europeans. And this is also important as a legacy part because we cannot understand, for example, Marco Polo, who traveled all the way to China in the 13th century, without this Crusader spirit. And also we cannot understand Christopher Columbus, for example. And this idea of exploration of Christians going abroad is started by the Crusader period, and is one of the legacies of the Crusades in the medieval times. So continuing in pre-modern times, in terms of politics, the Fourth Crusade, for example, contributed to accelerate the decline of Byzantium and its capital Constantinople, which after this event, never returned to a former glory. Now, from the Muslim perspective in this time, the Crusades were seen as a band of cruel invaders, and perhaps not without reason, since they were pretty bloody. After the initial shock that they had on the First Crusade, the fragmented Islamic kingdoms found a common goal to unite behind a common objective of recovering these holy sites. So in a way, if we can think that the Crusades changed the political scenario of the Middle East. The Fatimids disappeared from Egypt, there were consolidation of Sunni Islam in the region, and also a consolidation of ruling dynasties of Turkish origin that will replace the previous Arab dynasties and will establish the control over the Middle East for the centuries to come. Then that we can explain the Seljuks first, but also the coming of the Mongols later, the Ottomans, etc. Now, apart from the impact in medieval times, the Crusades had a lasting impact far beyond its time and well into the modern period. By the mid-19th century, the Crusades had become an emblem of European colonialism. All European colonial powers could use famous crusaders in their histories. For example, Germany will have Frederick Barbarossa, England will have Richard the Lionheart, and even a small country like Belgium could use Geoffrey of Boulogne as heroes of the past to justify what they were doing as a state in the 19th century. All made a liberal use of these heroic figures and presented them as precursors of modern imperialism all the way up to the First World War. More recently, since September 11, 2001, there has been a renewed interest in the Crusades in Western countries. Yet, I think it is important to take what Thomas Madden, one of the biggest specialists on the Crusades, said, that he mentioned that since 2001, although there was this renewed interest, there has been a gap between the historical understanding of the Crusade and a popular perception that remains pretty much extended out there. So I think it is important to rethink and revisit the sources always, especially with the concept of the Crusade, since there is a lot of it in the press nowadays, especially since 2001. Now, in the modern Islamic world, the Crusade as a phenomenon has not played a largely important role in the imagination of Muslims until recently, and that might sound very surprising from an European perspective. So even though the Crusades might have played a pivotal role among Europeans or in the imagination of Europeans in modern times, they were very small and largely insignificant event from the point of view of the Muslim world. After all, from a Muslim perspective, the Crusade was unsuccessful in the long run, and nothing too different from many other wars against infidel that occurred in the over 14 centuries of Islamic history. In the Muslim world, the Crusades became important up from the 20th century onwards, not to explain the history of the time when the events occurred, but to make sense of the European colonialism that controlled most of the Middle East after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the end of the First World War. In other words, In the Islamic world, the Crusades became a way to explain European imperialism in the 19th and early 20th century, and to rediscover a source of inspiration for liberation of Muslim nations with the nationalist Arab movement that emerged after the collapse of European empires in the Middle East after the Second World War. The impact of the Crusade in the modern world will deserve a larger and more nuanced explanation than the one allowed by the limited time we have in this video. However, I hope I have been able to offer insights into the phenomenon of the Crusades, a complex and long-lasting phenomenon that, although happened in medieval times, is still meaningful to make sense of our modern world. So that's all for today. I hope I managed to give you a general idea about the Crusades. Thanks for listening, and if you enjoyed this video, you might like to think about studying at Goldsmiths at some point. For more information on us and our history degrees and how to get in contact, don't forget to click on the links in the description below, that we'd love to hear from you in the near future. Thank you again.